In 1966, in-state tuition at the University of Texas was $144, and federal minimum wage was $1.25. And if you worked 20 hours a week for 10 months out of the year, that would be $1,000, meaning you could have worked a part-time minimum wage job and never bothered taking out a loan for college. The University of Pennsylvania, on the other hand, would cost you about $2,000, add $1,500 for room and board plus expenses, which means that part-time job is not going to cut it, so you might have to take out some loans at that point. But even if you did, you probably didn't spend years and years paying it off. You weren't taking out $54,000 but paying $140,000 because of psychotic interest payments. There was no way to borrow $69,000 but then owe $320,000. No one was leaving the country to escape student loans, and to my knowledge, figures like this didn't exist. So the question is, how did student debt get so bad, and whose fault is it? FDR signed the GI Bill in 1944. Part of what the bill did was pay for education. As soldiers came back from the war, they needed training and to be integrated into civilian life. So through the GI Bill, veterans were able to get $500 a year for tuition and even money for living expenses. In 1947, Harvard cost $525. So with the GI Bill, you could pretty much afford to go anywhere you wanted. And so by 1947, half of all new college students were from the military, and by 1956, almost 8 million people had used the GI Bill's education benefits. This was actually the most used part of the bill. The next big piece of legislation was in 1958 with the National Defense Education Act. If you were studying in a qualified field, you could borrow $1,000 a year from the government at 3% interest. Now in 1965, to expand higher education even further, and as part of LBJ's Great Society, the Higher Education Act was passed. This meant grants and scholarships, but also guarantees to banks that loans they gave out for college would be paid. Four-year degrees increased dramatically, high school graduation went up in this period as well. But this is actually when things really started to turn. Instead of the government granting you money for college like they did for returning veterans under the GI Bill, and instead of the government loaning you money directly at a low interest rate, now special considerations are being made for the banks. The idea was to phase out the National Defense Education Act, shifting loans to banks because this was the free enterprise way. Both Johnson and Nixon cut funding for the NDEA loans. Students were still paying 3% on their student loans, but banks were getting 7%. The government was paying the other 4%. In 1972, under Nixon, legislation passed establishing the Student Loan Marketing Association, Sallie Mae. So banks would lend money to students, but so banks could lend even more money to students, Sallie Mae could then buy the loans from the banks. The idea being that if the banks can easily dispose of a student loan, they would be more willing to lend to more students. Over the next 20 years, Sallie Mae grew and expanded and gained influence. During the 1990s, the Department of Education was virtually taken over from within when former Sallie Mae executives, as well as executives of other student loan companies, were given key management positions there. When Sallie Mae was gaining power, students were losing power. Protections started getting stripped in the 70s, but in 1990, the Crime Control Act made it so that people had to wait 7 years before they could discharge student debt through bankruptcy. Joe Biden was the chief sponsor of the Crime Control Act. In 1993, under Clinton, the Federal Direct Loan Program was created. Basically, people were getting mad that banks might be getting rich because of government subsidies for student loans. The idea was to create a way to give out student loans without involving the banks. Well, Sallie Mae didn't like that because they immediately started losing value. This was obviously a threat to private loan companies and aspiring private loan companies. So companies would do their best to fight the direct loan program. Lenders offered large sums of money to universities to drop out of the government's direct loan program. Sallie Mae would literally pay colleges commissions when their students took out loans through Sallie Mae. In 1997, Sallie Mae privatized. In 1998, another law passed that limited bankruptcy to those who could prove undue hardship. Biden supported this. And actually, because of low-income-driven repayment plans, payments for low-income borrowers can be as low as $0, which sounds good, except you're still shackled to it for a long time. And one other issue.
The income-driven repayment programs are set up to only last 20 or 25 years. So in theory, people like Mary will have paid $16,000 after 2 decades, and her then $53,000 balance would be forgiven. But a government report found that of all the borrowers at that stage, only 11% would be eligible for forgiveness. If they miss one payment, they become unenrolled in the program.
Now, Sallie Mae's lobbying efforts were as big as ever. In the 109th Congress, most of the House Education Committee and most of the Senate Education Committee were taking money from Sallie Mae. But from 2001 to 2006, the biggest recipient was John Boehner, who was chair of the House Committee on Education. He received $250,000 from Sallie Mae donors, and he would fly on Sallie Mae's corporate jet for golf outings. In return, Boehner would attempt to help make it impossible for students to refinance their student loans under better terms or rates. Coincidentally, it's around the same time frame that Sallie Mae's income from fees grew by 228%. This is Albert Lord. He was the CEO of Sallie Mae at the time. And this is his private golf course that predatory student loans helped build. But when he wasn't golfing, he was explaining in annual reports that Sallie Mae's record earnings were attributable in part to collections on defaulted loans. Wage garnishment, accrued interest, collections fees, late fees, and you have no choice but to deal with these charges because in 2005, they passed the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act. This is the legislation that made it virtually impossible to discharge student debt in bankruptcy. It was Republican-led, but had the support of 18 Democrats, including Joe Biden. In 1998, student debt was under $100 billion. And partially because of these bankruptcy laws, today student loan debt is at $1.8 trillion. The only protection that's guaranteed is that your Social Security benefits can't be garnished to the point that they fall below $750 a month, which is, of course, impossible to live on. $171 million was garnished from Social Security to repay student debt in 2015 alone. There's been legislation proposed like the Consumer Bankruptcy Reform Act of 2022, which would treat student debt like any other kind of debt, but so far, nothing like this has passed. And most recently, Biden's plan to forgive $10,000 in student loans, which would be great for some and meaningless for others, has been held up. In fact, the House and Senate, with the help of a couple Democrats, just voted to retroactively add interest to loans. The vote retroactively terminates the pause on federal student loan payments and interest accrual.
Republicans in Congress led an effort to pass a bill blocking my administration's plan to provide up to $10,000 in student debt relief and up to $20,000 for borrowers who received a Pell Grant.
Thankfully, Biden vetoed that bill. So who's to blame for student debt? Everyone who helped cut banks in on student loans, anyone who appointed people with private lending backgrounds to the Department of Education, and anyone who helped strip bankruptcy protections. And that's where we're at. If you want to understand more about this, you can read The Student Loan Scam by Alan Collins. A lot of this video is drawing from that. And that will do it for me. If you found this video interesting, make sure you are subscribed to Breaking Points, of course. You can also check out my YouTube channel where I talk about media and politics and other interesting things. Link in description. Liking and sharing always helps. Please do that. Thank you to Breaking Points. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.